Hello there, fellow seekers of the unknown. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're having a wonderful day, wherever you are in the world, whether it's morning coffee in New York, afternoon tea in London, or late night contemplation in Tokyo. I want you to know that you're part of a global community of curious minds. What time is it where you are? Are you listening from a bustling city or a quiet countryside? Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. We're building something special here, a place where the boundaries between fact and fiction blur, where the impossible becomes plausible, and where the greatest mysteries of our time find their voice. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you these stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about reality. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you about the most classified mission in human history. A mission so secret that for 60 years it existed only in the shadows of government archives and the nightmares of those who lived it. This is the story of the Serpo Protocol. July 8th, 1947, Roswell, New Mexico. The desert stretched endlessly under the unforgiving New Mexico sun, its silence broken only by the distant rumble of military vehicles converging on coordinates that would soon be erased from every map. Major William Blanchard stood at the edge of what the press would later call a weather balloon crash site, watching as soldiers in hazmat suits carefully extracted something that defied every law of physics he'd learned at West Point. The craft was no larger than a school bus, its surface a seamless amalgamation of metal that seemed to shift colour in the harsh sunlight. But it wasn't the technology that made Blanchard's hands tremble as he lit his third cigarette in 10 minutes. It was the bodies. 3 of them, humanoid but wrong, in ways that made his brain struggle to process what his eyes were seeing. Grey skin with an almost translucent quality, oversized heads that seemed too heavy for their thin necks, and eyes that remained open even in death, black and vast as the void between stars. 2 were clearly dead, their bodies twisted from the impact, but the third one moved. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Martinez, the first man to reach the site. "It's still breathing." Dr. Detlev Bronk, the biophysicist who'd been hastily flown in from Johns Hopkins, knelt beside the surviving being with the careful precision of a man who understood he was witnessing history. The creature's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost human, but not quite. When their eyes met, Bronk later wrote in his classified report, he felt something he couldn't explain. Not fear exactly, but a profound sense of being observed by an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. "We need to keep it alive," Bronk said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "This changes everything." General Nathan Twining, who had arrived from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base just hours earlier, nodded grimly. "Doctor, you have unlimited resources and absolute secrecy. Make it happen." What followed were 18 months of the most intensive interspecies communication effort in human history. The being, designated as Extraterrestrial Biological Entity 1, or EBE-1, was housed in a specially constructed facility beneath Wright-Patterson. Teams of linguists, mathematicians and physicists worked around the clock to establish some form of communication with their guest. The breakthrough came in the form of mathematics. Universal constants, it turned out, were truly universal. Pi, the speed of a light, the golden ratio, these became the building blocks of a crude but functional communication system. EB1 drew complex diagrams in the sand of his containment area, star charts that mapped constellations invisible to the naked eye from Earth. Through painstaking months of mathematical exchanges, a story emerged. EBE-1 was from a planet they called Serpo, orbiting a binary star system in what humans knew as Zeta Reticuli. His people, the Ebens, had been observing Earth for centuries, studying human development with the patience of beings who measured time in millennia rather than decades. The crash at Roswell hadn't been an accident. It had been a deliberate landing gone wrong, the first attempt at formal contact with the dominant species of the third planet from Sol. EB-1's ship had been damaged by atmospheric electrical interference, technology that worked perfectly in the thin atmosphere of Serpo, but failed catastrophically in Earth's denser air. But the most shocking revelation came in December 1950, when EB-E1, through a series of increasingly complex mathematical proofs, indicated that more of his people were coming. Not as invaders, but as diplomats. They wanted to establish what humans would later term an exchange program. President Eisenhower, briefed on the situation in a meeting so classified that no official record exists, reportedly sat in stunned silence for 10 minutes before speaking. "Gentlemen," he finally said, "we're no longer alone. God help us all." The deal was formalised in a series of secret meetings between 1952 and 1954. The Ebens would share their technology, their knowledge of the cosmos, and their understanding of physics that made interstellar travel possible. In exchange, they requested something that seemed almost innocent. They wanted to study human culture, human biology, and human psychology by hosting a small group of volunteers on their home world. 12 humans would travel to Serpo. The mission would last approximately 10 Earth years, though the time dilation effects of interstellar travel made precise calculations impossible. The volunteers would be military personnel, scientists, and specialists chosen for their psychological stability and their ability to adapt to extreme conditions. It was called the Serpo Protocol, and it would become the most classified operation in human history. EB-1 died in 1952, but not before transmitting a message to his homeworld through technology that human scientists still don't fully understand. The reply came 3 years later, not as a radio signal, but as a physical object that materialized in the Nevada desert, a communications device that allowed real-time dialogue across the impossible distances of space. The Ebens confirmed the exchange. They would send a ship to Earth in 1965. 12 humans would be selected, trained, and prepared for a journey that would take them farther from home than any human had ever travelled. General Emmett Harrow, chosen to oversee the project, kept a private journal throughout the selection and training process. His final entry, dated June 15, 1965, read, "We're not sending soldiers, we're sending witnesses. God knows what they'll witness, but history will judge us by what they become." The selection process began in earnest in 1962. Military personnel from all branches were screened for psychological stability, physical fitness, and perhaps most importantly, their ability to keep secrets. The final 12 were chosen not just for their skills, but for their capacity to represent humanity to a species that had watched our civilization rise from the primordial mud. Among them was Major Elias Rourke, a linguist and xenobiology analyst who had been working on the EB communication project since 1951. His selection was never in doubt. He had spent 4 years learning to think like an alien, to see the universe through eyes that had evolved under different stars. If anyone could survive 10 years on an alien world and return with his sanity intact, it was Rourke. He would be wrong about the sanity part. June 1965. Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico. The training facility existed in the space between official and unofficial, a collection of buildings that appeared on no maps and consumed resources that appeared in no budgets. For 3 years, 12 human beings prepared for a journey that would take them farther from Earth than the combined distance of every human expedition in history. Major Elias Rourke stood before a wall-sized star chart, his finger tracing the impossible line between Sol and Zeta Reticuli. 39 light-years. In human terms, it might as well have been 39 million. The Ebens had explained, through their mathematical language, that the journey would take approximately 10 months due to something they called gravitational corridor jumps, a method of faster-than-light travel that folded space like origami. "Still can't believe we're actually doing this," said Captain Sarah Chen, the mission's xenobiologist. She was one of only 2 women selected for the mission, chosen for her expertise in extremophile organisms and her psychological evaluation scores that suggested she could adapt to almost any environment. "Believe it," replied Dr. Marcus Webb, the team's physician. "In 3 days we'll be farther from home than any human has ever been, assuming we survive the trip." The 12 had been living, training and preparing together for 3 years. They knew each other's strengths, weaknesses, fears and hopes better than most married couples. They had to. For the next 10 years, they would be the only humans on a world that existed under alien stars. The team was carefully balanced. 4 military officers, 3 scientists, 2 engineers, 2 medical personnel, and 1 linguist. Each had been chosen not just for their primary skills, but for their secondary abilities. Rourke, for instance, was not just a linguist, but also a trained pilot and electrical engineer. Chen was a xenobiologist, who also held degrees in geology and atmospheric science. Every member of the team was in effect a Swiss Army knife of human knowledge and capability. Dr. Inez Marlowe, the mission's Earthside coordinator, had spent the last 3 years developing the monitoring systems that would track the team's vital signs, psychological states, and mission progress across the vast distances of space. Her laboratory, buried 3 levels beneath Wright-Patterson, contained communication equipment that incorporated both human and Eben technology. The biomonitoring systems are as ready as they can be, she reported to General Harrow during the final mission briefing. But we're operating on assumptions about physics that we don't fully understand. The Ebens assure us that quantum entanglement communication will work across interstellar distances, but we've never tested it. General Harrow nodded grimly. Doctor, this entire mission is built on assumptions. We're assuming the Ebens are telling the truth about their intentions. We're assuming our people can survive on their world. We're assuming they'll actually bring them back. He paused, lighting one of the cigars that had become his trademark during the project. We're assuming a lot of things because the alternative is to admit we have no idea what we're doing. The Eben ship arrived on schedule, materializing in the Nevada desert with no fanfare, no dramatic light show, no Hollywood special effects. One moment the desert was empty, the next moment a craft roughly the size of a small apartment building sat on the sand as if it had always been there. The technology involved was so far beyond human understanding that the scientists monitoring the arrival could only describe it as impossible. The ship itself was a marvel of engineering that seemed to defy every law of physics. Its surface was smooth to the point of being frictionless, made of a material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. There were no visible engines, no exhaust ports, no indication of how something so massive could move through space. It simply existed, a perfect example of technology so advanced it appeared to be magic. 3 Ebens emerged from the ship, moving with the fluid grace of beings who had evolved in lower gravity. They were taller than EB-1 had been, nearly 6 feet in height, with the same grey skin and oversized eyes that had become iconic in the years since Roswell. They communicated through a combination of telepathy and mathematical equations projected onto handheld devices that appeared to be made of crystallized light. The lead Eben, designated EBE-2 by the human team, approached General Harrow with what could only be described as ceremony. Through the translation device, he transmitted a message that had been prepared for this moment. We welcome the children of Saul to journey with us. They will see wonders beyond their current understanding. They will return changed, but they will return. The 12 volunteers said their goodbyes to Earth in a sterile conference room that had been set up for the occasion. Family members had been told they were being deployed on a long-term classified mission. The truth was so far beyond the realm of possibility that even the cover story seemed incredible. Rourke's final Earthside journal entry, dated July 16, 1965, read, "Today, we leave the only world humans have ever known. I've spent 3 years preparing for this moment, learning about Serpo, studying Eben culture, trying to understand what we're walking into. But standing here now, looking at that ship, I realise that nothing could have prepared us for this. We're not just leaving Earth, we're leaving everything that makes us human. I pray we can find our way back." The journey began with a sensation that defied description. The Eben ship didn't launch or take off in any conventional sense. Reality simply shifted around them, as if the universe had decided that they were no longer on Earth, but somewhere else entirely. The transition was so smooth that for a moment, Rourke wondered if they had moved at all. It was only when he looked through the ship's viewing portal that he realised the magnitude of what had just happened. Below them, Earth hung in the void like a blue marble, already so distant that the continents were barely visible. They had travelled farther in 30 seconds than humans had travelled in the entire history of space exploration. The ship's interior was a study in a functional minimalism. Curved walls that seemed to be made of the same light-absorbing material as the exterior, floor surfaces that provided perfect traction without being rough, and lighting that appeared to emanate from the walls themselves. The Ebens had prepared a section of the ship for their human guests, complete with sleeping quarters, a common area, and what appeared to be a food preparation facility. But it was the navigation chamber that truly highlighted the gulf between human and Eben technology. The room was dominated by a three-dimensional star map that showed their position in real time, their trajectory through space represented by a thin line of light that stretched from Sol toward Zeta Reticuli. The mathematics involved in plotting their course was so complex that Dr. Webb, who held a doctorate in theoretical physics, admitted he couldn't even understand the basic principles involved. "How do you calculate a route through folded space?" he asked EBE-2 during one of their daily communication sessions. The Ebens' response, translated through the device, was both simple and profound. "You don't calculate the route. You convince space to change its shape." The journey to Serpo would take 10 months ship time, but due to the effects of travelling through folded space, the actual passage of time was far more complex. According to the Eben calculations, they would arrive at Serpo having aged only about 8 months, while nearly a year would pass on Earth. The implications of this temporal displacement were staggering, but the human team had been prepared for it during their training. As Earth dwindled behind them and the stars ahead grew brighter, the 12 volunteers began to understand that they weren't just travelling to another world, they were travelling to another reality, one where the laws of physics were suggestions rather than absolute truths, where time itself could be manipulated, and where humanity's place in the universe was far smaller than anyone had ever imagined. 1966 to 1975, Serpo, Zeta Reticuli system. The first glimpse of Serpo came through the ship's viewing portal, as a rusty orange dot against the star-filled void. As they approached, the dot resolved into a world that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Continents and oceans were visible, but the colours were wrong. The land masses were various shades of orange and red, while the oceans appeared to be a deep purple-black. 2 suns hung in the sky, one larger and brighter than Sol, the other smaller and redder. "It's beautiful," whispered Lieutenant Angela Torres, the mission's communications specialist, as she watched the alien world grow larger in the viewport. "And terrifying." Dr. Chen was already taking readings with the portable instruments they'd brought from Earth. Atmospheric composition is roughly 60% nitrogen, 35% oxygen, with traces of argon and some compounds I don't recognise. It's breathable, but we'll need to monitor ourselves carefully for the first few months. The landing was as seamless as their departure from Earth had been. The ship simply settled onto the surface of Serpo as if it had always been there, the advanced technology making the arrival feel almost anticlimactic. When the boarding ramp lowered, the 12 humans got their first taste of alien air. It was hot, much hotter than they'd expected despite the briefings. The dual suns created a greenhouse effect that kept the surface temperature at a constant 107 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick and humid, carrying scents that were both familiar and strange. There was something like ozone, something like metal, and underneath it all an organic smell that reminded Rourke of a forest after rain, but wrong somehow. The gravity was lighter than Earth's, about 0.7 g, which made movement feel bouncy and imprecise. After the first few hours, several team members complained of nausea and disorientation, as their inner ears struggled to adjust to the alien environment. But it was the sky that truly drove home the fact that they were no longer on Earth. The 2 suns cast complex shadows that shifted and changed throughout the day. The larger sun provided most of the light, while the smaller red sun painted everything with an orange tint that made the landscape look like a perpetual sunset. At night, when both suns had set, the sky was filled with more stars than any human had ever seen, the centre of the galaxy visible as a brilliant stream of light across the heavens. The Eben settlement was a marvel of integrated architecture. Rather than building structures that sat on the landscape, the Ebens had grown their city into the landscape itself. Buildings flowed organically from the ground, their walls and roofs indistinguishable from the natural rock formations. The entire settlement looked like it had been carved from a single piece of stone, with passages and chambers that followed the natural contours of the terrain. "It's like they think in 3 dimensions, observed Captain Chen as they were led through the settlement. "Human architecture is based on straight lines and right angles. This is based on curves and natural flow." The Ebons themselves were gracious hosts, but their behaviour was often puzzling to the human visitors. They lived in a society with no apparent hierarchy, no leaders, no government in any sense that humans could understand. Decisions were made through a form of consensus that seemed to involve telepathic communication. Crime was non-existent, not because of laws or punishment, but because the concept of harming another being was simply incomprehensible to them. Privacy, as humans understood it, didn't exist. The Ebons lived in communal spaces where thoughts and emotions were shared freely. They found the human need for individual space and private thoughts both fascinating and slightly disturbing. Several times during the first months, Rourke found himself being studied by groups of Ebons who were trying to understand why humans needed to be alone with their thoughts. The first death occurred 6 months after their arrival. Sergeant James Morrison, one of the engineers, collapsed while working on a communication array. Dr. Webb's examination revealed massive internal hemorrhaging, but the cause was unclear. The symptoms were unlike anything in human medical literature, and the Ebon medical techniques were too advanced for the human team to understand. "It's like his blood just forgot how to clot," Webb reported in his medical log. "Every test I can run suggests his body is rejecting something, but I can't identify what. The Ebons say it's a reaction to the radiation from their dual suns, but our monitoring equipment doesn't show dangerous levels." Morrison died 3 days later, the first human to die on an alien world. The team buried him in a small ceremony at the edge of the settlement, marking his grave with a simple stone cairn that would become a shrine for the remaining members of the mission. The second disappearance was more mysterious. Lieutenant Patricia Huang, the mission's geologist, went out on a solo survey expedition and never returned. Search parties found her equipment scattered across a wide area, but no sign of her body. The Ebons seemed genuinely puzzled by her disappearance, claiming that their world had no dangerous wildlife and that she couldn't have simply gotten lost. "She was studying the mineral formations about 5 kilometres from the settlement," reported Captain Torres. "Her last transmission was routine, just standard geological observations. Then nothing. It's like she just vanished." The loss of 2 team members in less than a year created a psychological crisis for the remaining 10. They were alone on an alien world, dependent on beings they didn't fully understand, with no way to contact Earth except through the Ebon communication systems. The isolation was more complete than any human had ever experienced. Rourke found himself changing in ways that were both subtle and profound. His journal entries, transmitted to Earth through the Ebon communication system, showed a gradual shift in perspective that worried the Earthside monitors. "I stopped dreaming of Earth," he wrote in a transmission dated September 1967, "and I started dreaming in images I didn't understand. Last night I dreamed I was swimming through space, surrounded by stars that sang in mathematical harmonies. When I woke up, I could still hear the music, and for a moment I understood what it meant. But the understanding faded as soon as I tried to write it down." The mission psychologist, Dr. Amanda Stewart, noticed similar changes in the other team members. They were adapting to Serpo in ways that went beyond simple acclimatization. Their thought patterns were becoming more abstract, their problem-solving approaches more intuitive. They were becoming something new, something that was neither fully human nor fully alien. "We're changing," she reported to Earth in a classified transmission. "The change is subtle, but it's real. We're thinking differently, seeing the universe differently. I'm not sure we'll be the same people who left Earth when we return." The years passed in a rhythm dictated by the twin suns. Serpo's day cycle was 43.3 Earth hours, which meant that human circadian rhythms were constantly out of sync with the local environment. The team learned to sleep when exhaustion overcame them, rather than trying to maintain Earth normal schedules. They studied Ebon culture, technology and philosophy, transmitting their observations back to Earth through the quantum communication system. But the deeper they delved into Ebon society, the more they realised how fundamentally different the two species were. Humans were individuals first and social beings second. Ebons were collective entities who occasionally experienced individuality as a temporary state. The Ebons, for their part, were equally fascinated by their human guests. They studied human behaviour with the intensity of anthropologists, trying to understand concepts like ambition, jealousy, and love. They were particularly puzzled by human creativity, the ability to imagine things that didn't exist and then work to make them real. They create stories, reported one Ebon observer in a transmission that was intercepted by Earthside monitors. They create elaborate fictional narratives that serve no practical purpose. Yet these stories seem to provide them with emotional satisfaction. This behaviour is unique among the species we have encountered. By 1970, the mission had settled into a routine that was both productive and increasingly bizarre. The humans had learned to navigate Ebon society, to communicate through the telepathic interface systems, and to survive in an environment that was constantly trying to kill them. But they were also losing their connection to Earth, to humanity, to the species they had been born to represent. The third death occurred in 1972. Dr. William Chen, the xenobiologist, succumbed to what appeared to be a form of cancer, but unlike any cancer seen on Earth. The tumours were crystalline in structure, as if his body was trying to transform into something that could better survive on Serpo. The fourth death was a suicide. Captain Robert Hayes, one of the military officers, walked into the desert during a dust storm and was never seen again. His final message, left on his personal recording device, was simple. I can't remember what it feels like to be human. I can't remember why that matters. By 1975, 8 members of the original 12 remained. They had become something unprecedented in human history, a permanent alien diaspora, humans who had lived longer on an alien world than on Earth. They had adapted, evolved, and survived, but the cost was measured in ways that couldn't be quantified in mission reports. Rourke's journal entries from the final year on Serpo showed a man who had gained cosmic perspective at the cost of his humanity. I understand now why the Ebons agreed to this exchange, he wrote. They weren't studying us to learn about human nature. They were studying us to see what we would become when we were removed from the context that made us human. We are their experiment in forced evolution. The message that a ship would arrive to take them back to Earth came as both a relief and a terror. After 10 years on Serpo, the prospect of returning to a world they barely remembered was almost as frightening as the original journey into the unknown. 1975 to 1978, Blackhall Station, Antarctica. The journey back to Earth was a mirror image of their departure, but the 8 humans who entered the Ebon ship were fundamentally different from the 12 who had left a decade earlier. They were thinner, their skin bearing a greyish pallor that came from years under alien suns. Their eyes held a depth that spoke of having seen wonders and horrors in equal measure. Most disturbing of all, they moved with an unconscious grace that was distinctly non-human. Dr. Inez Marlowe, now the chief of xenobiology at Wright-Patterson, watched the ship's arrival through high-powered telescopes from a monitoring station in Nevada. The vessel materialised in the same manner as its departure, reality simply shifting to accommodate its presence. But something was different about this arrival. The ship lingered longer before touching down, as if its occupants were reluctant to complete their journey. Biomonitoring shows 8 human life signs, reported her assistant, Dr. Frances Cole, but the patterns are unusual. Their brain activity is showing wavelengths we've never recorded in human subjects. The reunion between the returning team and their Earthside counterparts took place in a sterile debriefing facility that had been constructed specifically for this purpose. The room was designed to feel comfortable and familiar, with earth plants, normal lighting and photographs of home. But the returning astronauts seemed uncomfortable in the space, as if they had forgotten how to exist in human-designed environments. Rourke was the first to speak, his voice carrying an accent that hadn't been there when he left. 10 years, 4 months, and 16 days, he said, his eyes focusing on something beyond the walls of the debriefing room. That's how long we were gone in ship time, but it feels like a lifetime. Several lifetimes. The initial medical examinations revealed changes that were both subtle and profound. The returning team members showed increased bone density, improved cardiovascular function, and neurological modifications that suggested their brains had adapted to process information in ways that were distinctly non-human. Most remarkably, they all showed evidence of low-level telepathic abilities, something that hadn't existed in humans before the mission. "They're still human," Dr. Marlowe reported to General Harrow, "but they've been changed on a fundamental level. It's as if exposure to Ebon society has activated dormant potentials in human neurology. They're thinking in ways that we can't fully comprehend." The debriefing process was intended to last 3 months. It ended up taking 3 years. The returning team was housed at Blackhall Station, a facility that officially didn't exist on the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica. The location was chosen for its isolation and its ability to maintain perfect security. The 8 survivors would live there for the next 3 years, undergoing the most intensive debriefing in military history. The stories they told were both fascinating and terrifying. They described a world where the laws of physics were fluid, where consciousness could be shared between individuals, where technology and biology had merged to create a civilization that was incomprehensibly advanced. But they also described a society that was utterly alien, where human concepts of individuality, privacy, and personal autonomy simply didn't exist. "The Ebons don't understand love," explained Dr. Stewart during one of her sessions. "They understand attachment, cooperation, and mutual benefit. But the idea that 2 beings could form an exclusive emotional bond that transcends rational analysis is completely foreign to them. They studied our human relationships the way we might study the mating rituals of insects." The most disturbing revelations came from the coded messages that the 2 missing team members had left behind. Hidden in the crystalline data storage devices that the Ebons had given them were personal logs that painted a picture of a mission that had gone far beyond its original parameters. Lieutenant Huang hadn't disappeared accidentally. She had been selected by the Ebons for what they called biological integration, a process that would allow her to survive permanently on Serpo by merging her consciousness with their collective intelligence. The process was described in clinical terms, but the implications were horrifying. Sergeant Morrison's death hadn't been from radiation exposure. He had been deliberately infected with a biological agent that would allow the Ebons to study human immune responses. His death was a necessary part of their research into human biological vulnerabilities. "We weren't guests," Rourke wrote in his classified debrief report. "We were lab rats, highly valued, well-treated lab rats, but lab rats nonetheless. The Ebons were studying us to understand how humans might be modified to survive in their environment. The exchange program was the first step in what they see as the inevitable integration of our species." The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating. Of the 8 survivors, 3 suffered complete psychological breakdowns within the first year of their return. They were hospitalized at a classified facility where they received round-the-clock care from psychiatrists who had been cleared for the highest levels of government secrecy. Captain Sarah Chen, the xenobiologist who had marvelled at Serpo's beauty during the landing, was found in her quarters at Blackhall Station with her wrists slit. Her suicide note was brief. "I can't live in a world where the sky only has one sun. I can't live knowing that we were never meant to come back unchanged. I can't live with what I've become." The remaining 5 survivors completed their debrief in 1978, but they were never allowed to fully return to society. They were given new identities, comfortable lives, and stipends that ensured they would never need to work again. But they were also monitored constantly, their every movement tracked, their communications intercepted, their contacts limited to other members of the program. The official files on the Serpo mission were buried under Project Morning Veil, a classification level so secret that fewer than 20 people in the government knew it existed. The mission became a ghost story, a legend whispered in the corridors of the Pentagon and the underground facilities of the defence establishment. "We made first contact," General Harrow wrote in his final report on the project, "and then we buried it in concrete." The technology that the Ebons had shared was quietly integrated into human development programs. advances in materials, science, energy generation, and communication systems over the following decades could be traced back to principles learned on Serpo. But the source of these innovations was hidden behind layers of classification and misdirection. The 5 survivors lived quiet lives, scattered across the country, each monitored by handlers who posed as friends or neighbours. They aged slowly, their modified biology extending their lifespans far beyond normal human parameters. They rarely spoke to each other, the shared trauma of their experience creating a bond that was too painful to acknowledge. But they remembered. They remembered the orange skies and the twin suns, the singing crystals and the collective consciousness of the Ebons. They remembered being part of something larger than themselves, and they remembered the price of that knowledge. And one of them, Major Elias Rourke, began to plan a way to tell the world what had really happened. 2005, undisclosed location. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, sent from an untraceable account to a mailing list of UFO researchers and conspiracy theorists. The subject line was simple. Project Serpo, the truth about Earth's first interstellar mission. The sender identified himself only as anonymous request. Victor Martinez, a former government employee who had become a prominent figure in the UFO research community, was the first to recognize the significance of what he was reading. The email contained detailed technical specifications, biological data, and personal accounts that were far too complex and internally consistent to be fabricated. "This is either the most elaborate hoax in history," Martinez said during a late-night phone call to his research partner, "or we're looking at the biggest leak of classified information since the Pentagon Papers." The first email was followed by dozens more, each containing additional details about the Serpo mission. Maps of the alien world's geography, atmospheric composition data, descriptions of Ebon technology, and personal logs from the mission members. The level of detail was staggering, covering everything from the biochemistry of alien food sources to the mathematical principles underlying faster-than-light travel. But it was the personal accounts that gave the documents their authenticity. The fear, wonder, and gradual psychological transformation of the mission members came through in every report. These weren't the sanitized accounts of a government cover-up. These were the raw, unfiltered experiences of humans who had lived through something unprecedented. Day 847. Lieutenant Torres reports increasing difficulty with temporal perception. She says the days feel like they're stretching, as if time itself is elastic here. Dr. Webb confirms similar symptoms in 3 other team members. We're changing, but we don't know what we're changing into. The emails painted a picture of a mission that had succeeded beyond all expectations and failed in ways that the planners had never anticipated. The humans had survived on an alien world, learned about a civilization that spanned multiple star systems, and returned with knowledge that could revolutionize human understanding of the universe. But they had also been changed in ways that made them question their own humanity. Rourke, writing under his anonymous alias, included details that only someone who had actually lived through the experience could know. The way the twin suns created complex shadow patterns that shifted throughout the day. The taste of Ebon food, which was nutritious but had a metallic aftertaste that never quite went away. The sound of wind through the crystalline structures of the alien city, which created harmonies that were almost musical. "The Ebons don't dream," he wrote in one email. "They share experiences while they rest, but they don't create the random neural narratives that humans call dreams. They were fascinated by our dreams, collected them somehow, studied them like we might study a new species of insect. They said our dreams were proof that humans were still evolving, still becoming something new." The emails also contained warnings. The Ebons hadn't abandoned their interest in humanity. They were still monitoring Earth, still studying human development, still planning for what they called the next phase of integration. The government's response was swift and predictable. Official denials were issued through multiple channels. The Defense Intelligence Agency released a statement calling the emails an elaborate work of science fiction designed to mislead the public. Richard Doty, a real Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent who had been involved in UFO disinformation campaigns, publicly confirmed that such a mission had taken place but claimed the details were exaggerated. But the cat was out of the bag. The Serpo emails spread across the internet like wildfire, translated into dozens of languages, analysed by researchers around the world. The level of technical detail made it impossible to dismiss as simple fiction, while the emotional authenticity of the personal accounts resonated with anyone who had ever wondered about humanity's place in the cosmos. Martinez found himself at the centre of a media storm that he hadn't anticipated. Television interviews, documentary crews, book offers, and constant harassment from both believers and skeptics. But through it all, he never heard from Anonymous request again. The emails stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving behind a mystery that would fuel conspiracy theories for decades. Present day, Arecibo Observatory, Puerto Rico, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the granddaughter of Dr. Inez Marlowe, had inherited more than just her grandmother's scientific curiosity. She had also inherited access to certain classified archives that officially didn't exist. As an astroarchaeologist specialising in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, she was perfectly positioned to recognise patterns that others might miss. The signal arrived on a frequency that was theoretically impossible for natural phenomena to generate. It lasted exactly 4.7 seconds and contained mathematical sequences that matched patterns described in the Serpo emails. More significantly, it contained something that made Elena's blood run cold. Coordinates. Not coordinates for Earth, but coordinates in space. A location in the Zeta Reticuli system that matched descriptions of Serpo's orbital position with frightening accuracy. "It's a recall signal," she whispered to her research partner as they analysed the data. "They're calling someone home." But the most terrifying possibility wasn't that the signal was meant for the two humans who had remained on Serpo 40 years earlier. The most terrifying possibility was that it was meant for their descendants, for hybrid beings who had been born under alien suns and were now ready to return to Earth. Eleanor published her findings in a paper that was immediately classified by the National Security Agency. But word leaked out, as it always does, and the UFO research community began connecting the dots between the Serpo emails, the mysterious signal, and a series of unexplained atmospheric phenomena that had been occurring around the world. 3 months after the signal was detected, Major Elias Rourke was found dead in his government-provided apartment. The official cause of death was heart failure, but those who knew him suspected otherwise. At age 89, he had been the last surviving member of the original Serpo mission, the keeper of secrets that governments would kill to protect. His final journal entry, discovered hidden in a safety deposit box, read, "They're coming back. Not the Ebens, but our people. The ones we left behind have become something new, something that belongs neither to Earth nor to Serpo. God help us all when they arrive, because they'll see us as we saw the Ebens, primitive beings clinging to an outdated definition of what it means to be intelligent life." The story of the Serpo Protocol remains officially denied by every government agency that has ever been asked about it. But in the deep archives of the Defense Intelligence Agency, in the classified sections of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and in the memories of a handful of aging scientists, the truth persists. Humanity made contact with an alien civilization. We sent our best and brightest to learn about them, and what we learned was that in the vast cosmos, being human might not be an advantage. It might be a limitation that evolution is eager to overcome. The orange skies of Serpo still shine in the dreams of those who remember. The twin suns still cast their complex shadows across the memories of the survivors. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, our lost astronauts are coming home, changed beyond recognition, carrying knowledge that will either elevate humanity or replace it entirely. The Serpo Protocol was never just about exploring space. It was about discovering what we would become when we finally left the cradle of Earth behind. The answer, it seems, is something that our species isn't quite ready to accept. But ready or not, our cosmic education is about to continue. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2027, buried between spam messages and LinkedIn notifications. Silas Rourke almost deleted it, mistaking the sender's address for another phishing attempt, but the subject line stopped him cold. Immediate contract opportunity. Devon Island Geological Survey. Devon Island. Even the name sent a chill through him. Silas had spent the last 5 years analysing satellite imagery for various aerospace contractors, his days consumed by pixel-perfect examinations of terrain that most humans would never see in person. At 32, he'd developed an eye for inconsistencies that his supervisors both valued and feared. His last position had ended abruptly when he'd questioned discrepancies in some orbital photography, asking too many questions about why certain images seemed staged. The email was from Dr. Kieran Solvey, Director of Field Operations for Volstrix Dynamics. The company name was familiar. They'd been mentioned in aerospace journals as a NASA contractor specialising in Mars mission preparation. The offer was generous. 3 months on Devon Island, Canada, conducting geological surveys for future off-world missions. The pay was almost too good to be true. Silas read the email 3 times before responding. He'd heard about Devon Island, the largest uninhabited island on Earth, located in the Canadian Arctic. Its barren, crater-scarred landscape was so similar to Mars that NASA had been using it as a training ground for years. The isolation appealed to him. After months of unemployment and mounting bills, the contract felt like salvation. Within 48 hours, he was on a plane to Resolute Bay, Nunavut. The flight to Devon Island was unlike anything Silas had experienced. The small charter plane carried only 8 passengers, all bound for the same destination. His fellow travellers were an interesting mix. A field biologist named Talia Miro, with kind eyes and nervous energy. A stoic mission director who introduced himself simply as Dr. Solvey. And several technical specialists who spoke in hushed tones about equipment protocols and communication blackouts. As the plane descended toward Devon Island, Silas pressed his face to the small window. The landscape below was alien. Rust-coloured earth stretched endlessly, broken only by ancient impact craters and the occasional rocky outcrop. It looked exactly like the Mars surface images he'd studied countless times in his career. The resemblance was uncanny, almost too perfect. The landing strip was nothing more than a graded dirt runway, but the infrastructure surrounding it was surprisingly sophisticated. Silas counted at least a dozen black shipping containers arranged in precise geometric patterns, connected by cables and surrounded by communication arrays that seemed far too advanced for a simple geological survey. Drones circled overhead in predetermined patterns, their cameras tracking the new arrivals. "Welcome to Mars," Dr. Solvey said with a thin smile as they disembarked. "You're home for the next 3 months." The comment struck Silas as odd. Most people would have said, "Welcome to Devon Island," or "Welcome to the Arctic." But Dr. Solvey had said Mars, as if the location's resemblance to the red planet was its primary identity. During the initial briefing, held in a heated container that served as the mission's command centre, Silas learned that their official purpose was to evaluate geological formations and test equipment for future Mars missions. The work seemed straightforward enough. Take samples, analyse terrain, and document everything for NASA's archives. But there were unusual restrictions that set his analytical mind on edge. No personal phones were allowed. All communication with the outside world had to go through official channels, using encrypted tablets provided by Volstrix. The internet connection was heavily filtered, with access limited to specific scientific databases and approved communication platforms. Even more strangely, they were required to maintain radio silence during certain hours of the day, with no explanation provided for these communication blackouts. "Security protocols," Dr. Solvey explained when Silas questioned the restrictions. "We're testing sensitive equipment here. Can't have any unauthorized signals interfering with our work." The explanation felt rehearsed, like a line from a script. That first night, Silas lay in his assigned bunk, listening to the Arctic wind howl across the barren landscape. The accommodation was a modified shipping container, surprisingly comfortable but completely isolated from the outside world. Through the small window, he could see the communication arrays blinking in the darkness, their lights creating an almost hypnotic pattern against the starless sky. Something felt wrong about this place, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. The first week on Devon Island passed in a blur of routine geological surveys and equipment testing. Silas found himself working closely with Talia Moreau, the field biologist, whose job was to study extremophile organisms that might provide insights into potential Martian life. She was intelligent and observant, with a background in astrobiology that made her invaluable to the mission. It was Talia who first pointed out the inconsistencies. "Have you noticed the rover tracks?" she asked during their third day of fieldwork. They were standing near a section of terrain that NASA claimed to use for rover simulations, examining the reddish soil that looked remarkably similar to Martian regolith. Silas looked where she was pointing. Clear tyre tracks crisscrossed the area in complex patterns, some overlapping others in ways that suggested multiple passes over the same ground. But here was the strange part. According to their mission schedule, the rover simulations weren't supposed to begin for another 2 weeks. "Maybe they're from previous missions," Silas suggested, though he wasn't convinced by his own explanation. "Look at the degradation pattern," Talia said, kneeling to examine the tracks more closely. "These are fresh, maybe a few days old at most, but the weather reports show we had a sandstorm last week that should have erased any surface markings." Silas pulled out his tablet and accessed the mission archives. The official record showed no rover activity on Devon Island for the past 6 months. According to Volstrax's documentation, this was the first operational mission of the year. "That's impossible," he muttered, comparing the physical evidence with the digital records. "Either the records are wrong, or someone's been running rover simulations without documenting them," Talia finished. They spent the next hour photographing the tracks and taking detailed measurements. The tyre patterns were consistent with NASA's current Mars rover design, but the paths seemed almost too perfect, following routes that would provide ideal camera angles and dramatic geological backdrops. It was as if someone had choreographed the rover's movement for maximum visual impact. That evening, Silas decided to do some digging. Using his encrypted tablet, he accessed Volstrax's internal network and began searching for any reference to previous Devon Island missions. The search results were frustratingly sparse, just vague references to preparatory surveys and equipment calibration, with no detailed logs or photographic evidence. But buried in a technical support forum, he found something interesting. A post from a Volstrax technician dated 3 months earlier mentioned troubleshooting Studio B connectivity issues on Devon Island. The post had been quickly deleted, but cached fragments remained in the system. Studio B. That was a designation he hadn't heard during any of their briefings. The next morning, Silas set out to explore the island more thoroughly. The official mission area was relatively small, confined to a valley between 2 low ridges. But Devon Island was enormous, over 21,000 square miles of uninhabited wilderness. Surely there were areas beyond their designated zone that might hold answers. He found Studio B by accident, following a set of heavy vehicle tracks that led away from the main camp. The tracks were partially obscured by recent snowfall, but they formed a clear path toward a cluster of boulders about 2 miles from the official mission perimeter. Hidden among the rocks was a structure that definitely wasn't in any of the mission documentation. It looked like a large shipping container, but heavily modified with additional ventilation systems and what appeared to be a satellite uplink array. A discreet sign near the entrance read, "Studio B, authorized personnel only." The entrance was secured with a biometric scanner, far more sophisticated than anything else Silas had seen on the island. When he approached, the scanner activated automatically, bathing his face in red light before flashing an "access denied" message. He circled the structure, looking for windows or any other way to see inside. The building was completely sealed, with no external indication of its purpose, but the ventilation system was running constantly, and he could hear the faint hum of electronic equipment from within. On his way back to camp, Silas noticed something else that made his pulse quicken. Mounted on a nearby ridge was a high-resolution camera system, perfectly positioned to capture the main rover testing area. The camera wasn't part of the official mission equipment. He'd memorized every piece of technology listed in their operational briefing. That night he shared his discoveries with Talia during their evening meal. They sat in the communal dining container, speaking in whispers while the other team members focused on their own conversations. "I've been noticing things too," Talia admitted. "The communication blackouts always seem to coincide with drone activity, and yesterday I saw Dr. Solvi uploading files to a server that's not part of our official network." "What kind of files?" "Video footage, Mars rover footage, or at least footage that looked like it was from Mars, but the timestamp showed it was recorded here, on Devon Island." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic weather. "Are you saying they're filming fake Mars footage?" "I don't know what I'm saying yet, but something's not right about this place." They agreed to continue investigating, but carefully. Whatever was happening on Devon Island, it was clearly being kept secret from most of the mission team. They needed more evidence before drawing any conclusions. The opportunity came during their second week, when a severe weather system moved across the island. The storm brought blinding snow and winds that made outdoor work impossible, forcing the entire team to remain in the heated containers for 36 hours. But weather emergencies also meant relaxed security protocols. During the storm, normal communication blackouts were suspended, and the constant drone surveillance was grounded. It was the perfect time for Silas to make his move. He waited until 2 a.m. when the camp was quiet except for the howling wind. Using a maintenance access code he'd observed Dr. Solvi enter earlier that week, Silas slipped out of his accommodation and made his way through the storm towards Studio B. The journey was treacherous. The snow was so thick that he could barely see 5 feet ahead, and the wind threatened to knock him off his feet with every step. But the storm also provided perfect cover. Anyone monitoring the camp's security systems would dismiss his movement as weather-related interference. Studio B loomed out of the swirling snow like a geometric ghost. The biometric scanner was still active, its red light cutting through the darkness. But Silas had come prepared. Earlier that day, he'd managed to lift a security keycard from Dr. Solvi's jacket while helping him clear ice from the communication arrays. The keycard worked, the scanner flashed green, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside, Silas found himself in an airlock-style entry chamber. After a few seconds, the inner door opened automatically, revealing a space that took his breath away. Studio B was a fully equipped television production facility, disguised as a simple shipping container. The main area housed a massive green screen dome, at least 40 feet in diameter, surrounded by professional lighting equipment and camera systems. Computer workstations lined the walls, their screens displaying what appeared to be Mars terrain data and rover telemetry. But the most shocking discovery was in the centre of the dome, a perfect replica of a Mars rover, complete with camera systems and scientific instruments. The rover was positioned on a section of artificial Martian terrain, with the green screen providing a 360-degree backdrop for filming. Silas approached one of the computer workstations, his hands trembling with excitement and fear. The screen showed real-time feeds from multiple cameras, all focused on the replica rover. But these weren't test feeds. They were being actively uploaded to NASA's public servers, complete with official timestamps and mission data. A thick operations binder lay open on the desk, its pages filled with detailed information that made Silas's blood run cold. The cover page read, "Either Script, Sol 3247. Inside, he found page after page of pre-written content, Twitter posts for NASA's official Mars rover account, complete with specific timestamps and engagement metrics, scripted rover malfunctions and recovery procedures, a public emotion index that tracked social media responses to Mars mission updates, detailed storyboards for discovering Martian geological formations, technical specifications for creating realistic Mars weather effects. One page contained a chilling directive: maintain public interest through carefully managed crisis scenarios. Rover malfunction events should occur every 45 to 60 days to maximise emotional investment without triggering skepticism. Silas photographed every page using his tablet's camera, working quickly while keeping an eye on the door. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a Mars simulation facility. It was a content creation studio, designed to manufacture fake Mars exploration footage for public consumption. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In a locked filing cabinet, Silas found a folder marked ECHO Protocol, Historical Documentation. Inside were mission reports dating back to 2014, detailing the failure of primary Mars mission objectives and the implementation of narrative maintenance protocols. According to the documents, the real Mars rover mission had encountered catastrophic problems in 2014, problems that would have ended public support for space exploration if revealed. Instead of admitting failure, NASA had partnered with private contractors to create a false narrative of continued success. Devon Island had been chosen as the perfect filming location because of its natural similarity to Mars. The isolated location and extreme weather conditions ensured that unauthorized access was nearly impossible. Over the past 13 years, hundreds of hours of Mars footage had been created here and seamlessly integrated into NASA's official communications. The scope of the deception was staggering. Every Mars rover photo, every geological discovery, every triumph and setback had been carefully scripted and filmed on this frozen island in the Canadian Arctic. Silas spent over an hour documenting everything, copying files to a hidden partition on his tablet. The evidence was overwhelming, but he needed to be strategic about how to use it. Going public immediately would be dangerous. The people running this operation had too much invested to let it be exposed easily. As he prepared to leave, Silas noticed something else that made his heart race. A communication log on one of the workstations showed recent messages between Devon Island and multiple government agencies. The message headers contained phrases like containment protocols and asset retrieval procedures. They weren't just creating fake Mars footage. They were prepared to deal with anyone who discovered the truth. Silas made it back to his accommodation without being detected, but sleep was impossible. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered. The Mars mission that had inspired millions of people around the world was a lie. Worse, it was a lie backed by enormous resources and sophisticated security measures. He needed to find a way to get the evidence off the island, but the communication restrictions made that nearly impossible. All internet access was monitored, and file transfers were automatically scanned for unauthorized content. Even if he could upload the evidence, there was no guarantee it wouldn't be intercepted before reaching the outside world. The next morning, Silas noticed changes in the camp's atmosphere. Dr. Solvey seemed more watchful, and several team members who had been friendly before now avoided eye contact. Most disturbing of all, the drone surveillance had intensified. The unmanned aircraft now followed individual team members during their outdoor work, maintaining constant visual contact. "Something's wrong," Talia whispered during their midday meal. "I tried to access my personal email this morning, and the system flagged it as a security violation. They're monitoring everything more closely now." Silas nodded, careful not to reveal what he'd discovered. He needed to be sure who he could trust before sharing the evidence from Studio B. That afternoon, while conducting routine soil sampling in the rover testing area, Silas noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The rover tracks had changed again, new patterns overlaying the old ones, creating a complex maze of tyre marks. But according to the mission schedule, no rover testing was supposed to occur for another week. He followed the tracks to their termination point near the cluster of boulders that concealed Studio B. Hidden among the rocks was a second rover, identical to the one he'd seen in the studio, but this one was actively being used for outdoor filming. As he watched through binoculars, Silas saw a small crew emerge from Studio B. They were setting up camera equipment and preparing to film the rover in action. The entire operation was being conducted with military precision, with crew members communicating through encrypted radio systems. But the most chilling realization was that this wasn't a simulation or training exercise. The crew was actively creating new Mars footage that would be released to the public within days. The deception was ongoing, happening in real time. That evening, Silas made a decision that would change everything. He needed to contact the outside world, regardless of the risk. Using his tablet, he accessed a hidden partition where he'd installed an encrypted communication app during his first week on the island. The app connected to satellite networks that bypassed Volstrax's monitoring systems. but using it was extremely dangerous. If detected, it would immediately reveal that he'd been conducting unauthorized activities. Silas crafted a careful message to a journalist friend in Toronto, someone he trusted to handle sensitive information responsibly. He attached selected photos from Studio B and a brief explanation of what he'd discovered. "The Mars mission is fake," he wrote. "They're filming everything on Devon Island and passing it off as genuine exploration footage. I have evidence, but I'm not safe here. If something happens to me, publish everything." He sent the message at 3 a.m. when network monitoring was typically at its lowest level. The upload took nearly 20 minutes, and every second felt like an eternity. The next morning, Silas woke to find Talia missing from the morning briefing. Dr. Solvey explained that she'd been transferred to another project due to family circumstances, but her personal belongings were still in her accommodation, and there was no record of any flight departures from the island. "Where did she go?" Silas asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "That's classified information, Doctor," Solvey replied. "I'm sure you understand the need for operational security." But Silas understood something else entirely. Talia had been asking too many questions, and now she was gone. The same thing could happen to him at any moment. That afternoon, while conducting routine geological surveys, Silas discovered something that confirmed his worst fears. Hidden in a rock crevice near the rover testing area was a small electronic device, a signal booster for encrypted communications. The device was still warm, indicating recent use. But more importantly, it was tuned to a frequency that he recognized from his signal intelligence training in the military. It was the frequency used by Echo Protocol. Echo Protocol was a military-grade communication system designed for deep cover operations. The name had appeared in the Studio B documentation, but Silas had assumed it was just another code name for the Mars Deception Project. Now he realized the truth was far more sinister. Echo Protocol wasn't just about fake Mars footage. It was a comprehensive disinformation system designed to control public perception of space exploration, and Devon Island was just one node in a much larger network. That night, Silas intercepted a message on the Echo Protocol frequency. The transmission was heavily encrypted, but he managed to decode fragments using military software he'd installed on his tablet. The message was chilling. "Subject has accessed restricted areas. Recommend immediate containment. Retrieval team dispatched. Maintain operational security until asset extraction complete." They knew he'd been in Studio B. They knew he'd discovered the truth, and they were coming for him. Silas had less than 12 hours before the retrieval team arrived. The encrypted message had included a timeline. ETA 0600 hours, weather permitting. It was already past midnight, and the Arctic dawn would bring his captors. He considered his options carefully. The camp was isolated with no means of independent transportation. The nearest settlement was over 100 miles away, across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Even if he could somehow survive the journey, he would likely be tracked and captured before reaching safety. His only hope was the abandoned weather station that Talia had mentioned during their first week. She'd discovered it during a biological survey, about 15 miles northwest of the main camp. The station had been defunct for years, but it might still have functional communication equipment. Silas spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing for his escape. He packed emergency supplies, downloaded offline maps to his tablet, and created multiple backup copies of the evidence from Studio B. Most importantly, he configured his tablet to automatically upload all data to several cloud storage services if he failed to check in within 72 hours. At 4 a.m, he slipped out of his accommodation and began the treacherous journey across the frozen landscape. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind cut through his Arctic gear like a blade. But the harsh conditions also provided perfect cover. No one would expect him to attempt such a dangerous journey in these conditions. The weather station was even more isolated than he'd expected. The building was partially buried in snow, its communication arrays twisted and broken by years of Arctic storms. But the structure was still intact, and more importantly, it was equipped with an emergency satellite uplink system. Silas spent 4 hours getting the equipment operational, using components salvaged from the damaged arrays. The system was primitive compared to Volstrax's sophisticated network, but it would be enough to upload his evidence to multiple servers around the world. As he worked, he could hear aircraft in the distance, helicopters conducting search patterns around the main camp. The retrieval team had arrived, and they would soon discover his absence. The satellite uplink finally came online at 11 a.m. Silas uploaded everything: the photos from Studio B, the Echo Protocol documentation, the communication logs, and a detailed written account of his experiences on Devon Island. He sent copies to journalists, government officials, and several scientific institutions that had been involved in Mars exploration. But as he prepared to leave the weather station, Silas heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. Through the building's ice-covered windows, he could see 2 black aircraft circling the area, their occupants clearly searching for him. The retrieval team had found him. The helicopters landed simultaneously, disgorging a team of 6 people dressed in Arctic gear and carrying military-style equipment. They moved with professional precision, surrounding the weather station within minutes. "Mr. Rourke," a voice called through a megaphone. "This is Agent Ray Dinnis with the Department of Scientific Security. We need to speak with you about your recent activities." Silas had never heard of the Department of Scientific Security, but the title sounded official enough to be believable. He remained silent, hoping they would assume the station was empty. "We know you're inside," Agent Dinnis continued. "We're here to help you understand the situation. There's been a misunderstanding about your assignment on Devon Island." The approach was sophisticated, not threatening, but offering a reasonable explanation for everything he'd witnessed. It was the kind of psychological manipulation that suggested extensive training in handling whistleblowers. "Mr. Rourke, we know you've accessed classified materials. We're not here to harm you. We're here to provide context for what you've seen and help you understand the larger picture." Silas made his decision. Using the weather station's emergency exit, he slipped out of the building and began moving toward a cluster of boulders that might provide cover. The landscape was completely exposed, but the rocks were his only hope of avoiding immediate capture. He made it 50 yards before the tranquilizer dart hit him. The drug worked quickly, flooding his system with a warm numbness that made his limbs heavy and his vision blurry. As consciousness faded, he heard Agent Dinnis speaking into a radio. "Asset secured. Initiate memory protocol. Clean sweep authorization granted." The last thing Silas remembered was being lifted onto a stretcher and loaded into one of the helicopters. As the aircraft lifted off, he caught a glimpse of the weather station below. A team of technicians was already dismantling the communication equipment, erasing any evidence of his desperate attempt to contact the outside world. 6 months later, Dr. Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist in Toronto, received an anonymous email containing several gigabytes of encrypted data. The files detailed an elaborate conspiracy involving fake Mars exploration footage, military-grade psychological operations, and the systematic elimination of whistleblowers. The evidence was compelling, but when Dr. Chen attempted to verify the story, she encountered a series of dead ends. Volstrax Dynamics had no record of anyone named Silas Rourke. Devon Island research stations denied any knowledge of suspicious activities. Most disturbing of all, there was no evidence that Silas Rourke had ever existed. Birth records, employment history, educational credentials, everything that would normally document a person's life had been scrubbed from official databases. It was as if 32 years of existence had been systematically erased. Dr. Chen spent months investigating, but every lead turned into a dead end. The few people who claimed to remember Silas Rourke gradually changed their stories, insisting they had been mistaken or confused. The anonymous email remained the only evidence of his existence. On a cold March morning, almost exactly 1 year after Silas Rourke had accepted a contract to work on Devon Island, NASA released a new batch of Mars rover photos. The images showed spectacular geological formations and evidence of ancient water activity, exactly the kind of discoveries that captured public imagination and justified continued space exploration funding. But in the corner of one photo, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a small detail that shouldn't have been there. A weathered signpost, partially obscured by artificial Martian terrain, with text that read, Ward Glacier, Nunavut. Ward Glacier was located on Devon Island, in the Canadian Arctic territory of Nunavut. The photo was viewed by millions of people around the world, but only a handful noticed the geographic impossibility. Those who did were quickly dismissed as conspiracy theorists, their observations lost in the noise of social media and dismissed by official fact-checkers. The Mars exploration program continued, releasing regular updates about humanity's greatest space adventure. The public remained fascinated by the Red Planet, unaware that their dreams of interplanetary exploration were being manufactured in a frozen studio thousands of miles from the nearest rocket launch pad. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of classified government programs, a file marked Echo Protocol, Silas Rourke, was sealed and archived, containing the complete psychological profile of a man who had never existed. Dr. Chen kept the encrypted files, but she never published the story. The evidence was too extraordinary to believe, and the implications too dangerous to pursue. Sometimes, late at night, she would examine the Mars rover photos, looking for other signs of terrestrial geography hidden in the alien landscape. She never found any, but she never stopped looking. The Red Planet remained red, the public remained fascinated, and the truth remained buried in the Arctic ice of Devon Island, the place where Mars came to Earth, and where inconvenient questions disappeared forever. Mars, as it turned out, was indeed farther away than anyone had imagined, but not in the way they had been told. My name is Daniel Rhodes, and for 32 years I analysed threats that didn't officially exist. NSA, CIA, a few acronyms that still don't have Wikipedia pages. I spent my career in the spaces between the lines of declassified documents. When I retired in 2012, I thought I was done with secrets. I thought I could finally sleep without wondering what shadows were moving in the dark corners of geopolitics. Then flight MH370 vanished, and sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. March 8th, 2014, 12:41 a.m. local time. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 pushes back from Gate C1 at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old, 18,365 flight hours. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old, transitioning to the Boeing 777. Between them, they carried the lives of 237 passengers and crew toward what should have been a routine 6-hour flight to Beijing Capital International Airport. The flight proceeded normally for exactly 38 minutes. At 1:19 a.m, First Officer Hamid's voice crackled through the radio. "Good night, Malaysian 370. It was the last transmission anyone would officially acknowledge receiving from the aircraft. Within 2 minutes, the plane's transponder went silent. The secondary surveillance radar that had been tracking MH370 across Malaysian airspace suddenly showed nothing but empty sky. For the next 4 hours, Malaysian air traffic control waited. They made calls, they checked systems, they assumed technical difficulties, weather interference, communication failures, anything except the truth that was already unfolding 35,000 feet above the South China Sea. The plane had not crashed. It had not exploded. It had simply ceased to exist on every screen, every monitor, every system designed to track commercial aircraft across one of the world's busiest flight corridors. But here's what the public wasn't told in those first crucial hours. MH370 didn't just vanish from Malaysian radar. It disappeared from secondary surveillance systems across 3 countries simultaneously. The odds of spontaneous coordinated system failure across sovereign airspace boundaries are so astronomically low that they approach impossibility. I learned this not from CNN or the BBC, but from a phone call I received 6 months after the disappearance. The caller identified himself only as Mitchell, a voice I hadn't heard since a classified briefing in Langley sometime around 2009. "Danny," he said, using a nickname only 5 people on Earth were authorised to use, "you still got that security clearance." "Retired, not revoked," I replied. "Why?" "Look at Diego Garcia, and stop trusting the satellite data." The line went dead. Mitchell had always been a man of few words, but this was cryptic even for him. Diego Garcia, the US military atoll in the British Indian Ocean Territory, one of the most secretive bases on the planet. What could a missing Malaysian airliner possibly have to do with a facility that officially didn't conduct operations that required congressional oversight? I spent the next week telling myself to let it go. I was retired. I had a small house in Vermont, a garden that needed tending, and a pension that would keep me comfortable until the inevitable heart attack or cancer diagnosis that seems to find everyone in my former line of work. But Mitchell's words echoed in my mind with the persistence of a smoke alarm at 3 a.m. So I started digging. The first thing I discovered was that Diego Garcia's location placed it roughly 2,400 miles southwest of MH370's last known position, exactly within the range of a Boeing 777 carrying the fuel load that MH370 had taken on in Kuala Lumpur. The second thing I discovered was that there had been a suspicious gap in radar coverage along what I came to call the Southern Silence Corridor, a stretch of airspace between Indonesia and the southern Indian Ocean, where civilian and military radar systems created a blind spot large enough to hide a commercial airliner. The third thing I discovered changed everything. Inmarsat, the British satellite communications company, had been quietly collecting data from MH370 long after the plane's transponder went dark. Their satellites had continued to exchange handshake signals with the aircraft for 6 hours and 11 minutes after the last radar contact. 6 hours. The plane had not crashed in the South China Sea, as initial search efforts assumed. It had continued flying, following a path that led it far from any intended destination. The official investigation eventually acknowledged this data, but only after Malaysian authorities had spent weeks searching in entirely the wrong location. By the time search efforts shifted to the southern Indian Ocean, any physical evidence had been scattered by currents, weather, and time across an area roughly the size of the continental United States. But I had access to resources that the general public and most journalists did not. Through a network of former colleagues who owed favours to other former colleagues, I obtained copies of the raw Inmarsat data, complete with technical annotations that had been redacted from public releases. What I found in those margins made my hands shake as I read. The satellite pings showed that MH370 had not simply flown south and crashed. The aircraft had made a series of altitude changes and course corrections that suggested active piloting throughout its final hours. More troubling, the ping intervals showed periods where the aircraft appeared to be flying in holding patterns, circles in the sky, as if waiting for clearance to land somewhere. I cross-referenced the ping data with maritime traffic records from the Indian Ocean shipping lanes. On the night of March 8, 2014, there had been an unusual absence of commercial vessels along MH370's projected flight path. Ships that should have been in the area according to their filed routes had mysteriously altered course or delayed departure from their previous ports. It was as if someone had cleared a corridor through one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Then I found the eyewitness accounts. In September 2014, residents of Kudahuvadhu Island in the Maldives reported seeing a low-flying aircraft around 6:15 a.m. local time on March 8th, roughly 6 hours after MH370's last radar contact. The aircraft was white with red stripes, consistent with Malaysia Airlines livery. It was flying unusually low, heading southwest toward the open ocean. The Maldivian government initially investigated these reports, then suddenly classified them and refused to comment further. When pressed by international media, officials claimed the sightings were not credible. and suggested residents had mistaken a domestic flight for the missing airliner. But I knew something the Maldivian government apparently didn't want publicised. There were no scheduled domestic flights over Kuda Huvadu at 6:15 a.m. on March 8th, 2014. The island's airport had been closed for runway maintenance since March 5th. The nearest aircraft that morning should have been a Maldivian air taxi flight that wasn't scheduled to depart Malé until 7:30 a.m, more than an hour later, and travelling in the opposite direction. Southwest of the Maldives lay 800 miles of empty ocean, then Diego Garcia. I began to construct a timeline that made my former career in intelligence analysis seem quaint by comparison. Malaysia Airlines Flight 3. 70 had not crashed. It had been diverted along a carefully planned route that avoided radar detection, maritime traffic, and civilian observation until the very last moment, when residents of a remote island happened to look up at the right time and see something they were never supposed to witness. But why? What could be worth orchestrating the disappearance of a commercial airliner and the deaths of 239 innocent people? The answer lay not in the aircraft itself, but in its passenger manifest. Every intelligence analyst learns to look for patterns that exist just below the surface of apparent randomness. Flight MH370's passenger list contained several patterns that should have triggered security reviews long before the aircraft ever left the ground. 20 passengers worked for Freescale Semiconductor, a Texas-based company specializing in microprocessors and embedded systems. They were traveling to Beijing for a technical conference, carrying laptops and documentation related to advanced radar and stealth technology applications. Among them was Dr. Chen Wei, a lead engineer on what Freescale internally called Project Mirror, research into electronic systems that could manipulate radar signatures in real time. 4 passengers were travelling on stolen Austrian and Italian passports. The men who had stolen these documents were identified within days of the disappearance, but the identities of the individuals who had used them to board MH370 remain unknown. Interpol confirmed that the stolen passport holders had purchased their tickets with cash through a travel agency in Bangkok that had no record of the transactions beyond the basic booking information. Then there was Yen Lo. Yen Lo was listed on the passenger manifest as a software consultant, travelling from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. But Yen Lo was not a software consultant. According to files I obtained through channels that I cannot and will not identify, Yen Lo was a former Chinese military cyber analyst who had been quietly developing quantum encryption algorithms for the People's Liberation Army's 3rd Department, their Signals Intelligence Division. 6 months before MH370's disappearance, Yen Lo had approached the CIA through an intermediary, claiming he wanted to defect. He possessed what he described as breakthrough research in quantum-resistant encryption that could render current Western surveillance capabilities obsolete within a decade. The agency had been in preliminary negotiations with Yen Lo since December 2013, but those talks had stalled over disagreements about his financial demands and the security of his family members still living in mainland China. What Yen Lo didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his communications with the CIA had been intercepted by the National Security Agency's Special Collection Service, operating out of the US Embassy in Kuala Lumpur. The NSA had been tracking Yen Lo's movements, monitoring his communications, and building a profile of his research capabilities since October 2013. I spent weeks trying to reconstruct the intelligence picture that would have been available to decision-makers in the days before MH370's disappearance. What I found was a convergence of strategic interests that painted a very different picture of the flight's final hours. Freescale Semiconductor's largest institutional shareholder was a private equity firm called Jacob Partners, which had been linked in classified reports to DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, funding for experimental radar systems. The 20 Freescale employees on MH370 weren't just attending a technical conference. They were carrying prototype hardware and source code for systems that could theoretically render aircraft invisible to conventional radar. Yen Lo's quantum encryption research represented a potential paradigm shift in signals intelligence. If his algorithms proved viable, They could invalidate decades of NSA investment in cryptographic analysis capabilities. More immediately, they could allow Chinese intelligence services to communicate in ways that Western agencies could never decrypt or even detect. The convergence was too perfect to be coincidental. On a single flight, travelling from a region with minimal air traffic control oversight toward Beijing, where both the free-scale technology and Yenlo's research would disappear into Chinese military development programs, were the components of what could become a decisive intelligence advantage for America's primary strategic rival. But there was one more pattern I couldn't ignore. 3 weeks before MH370's disappearance, a Boeing 777 identical to the aircraft that would become Flight 370 had been spotted at Diego Garcia during a routine satellite pass by a commercial imaging provider. The plane had been parked in a maintenance hangar normally reserved for US military aircraft. When I obtained higher resolution images through back-channel contacts, I could make out something that made my blood run cold. The aircraft's unique antenna array configuration matched MH370's specifications exactly. Someone had been planning this operation for weeks, possibly months. They had positioned assets, cleared flight corridors, and prepared facilities. All they needed was the right opportunity. A flight carrying passengers whose disappearance would serve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. Flight MH370 had not been the victim of mechanical failure, pilot suicide, or hijacking by terrorists. It had been hijacked by the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus on Earth, using methods that most people couldn't imagine and wouldn't believe if they were told. But the operation hadn't ended with the aircraft's disappearance. In fact, that was only the beginning. In November 2015, 18 months after MH370's disappearance, I received an encrypted email from an address I didn't recognize. The message contained only a phone number and the words, Hangar 7, Test Flight 847. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes before I realized what I was looking at. Hangar 7 was a maintenance facility at Boeing's Everett plant, where experimental avionics systems were tested and installed. Test Flight 847 was a program I remembered from classified briefings in 2010, an attempt to develop optical camouflage systems for military aircraft. I called the number. Mr. Rhodes? The voice was nervous, middle-aged, with a slight southern accent. My name is Marcus Webb. I used to work for Boeing. I think we need to talk. We met 3 days later at a diner outside Everett, Washington. Marcus Webb was thin, pale, with the kind of perpetual exhaustion that comes from carrying secrets that are too heavy to sleep with. He had worked as an avionics technician for Boeing for 15 years, specializing in experimental radar and communication systems. In 2013, he had been assigned to a classified project that he knew only by its internal designation, Ghost Protocol. They told us we were developing stealth capabilities for the next generation of military transports, Webb explained, stirring sugar into coffee with hands that shook slightly. Optical masking at high altitudes. The idea was to make aircraft essentially invisible to both radar and visual observation by manipulating electromagnetic signatures in real time. The technology worked by using a network of sensors and transmitters built into the aircraft's skin. These components would detect incoming radar signals, analyze their characteristics, and broadcast counter-signals designed to cancel out the aircraft's radar signature. Simultaneously, optical sensors would analyze the visual background above and below the aircraft, then project those images onto panels covering the aircraft's exterior surfaces. We tested it twice, Webb continued. First test was a partial success. We achieved about 60% radar signature reduction and maybe 40% optical camouflage. But the second test... He paused, staring into his coffee. The second test, something went wrong. The aircraft just vanished. Completely. Our own radar couldn't track it. Visual observers lost sight of it. Even GPS seemed to fail. For about 8 minutes, we had no idea where a Boeing 777 was flying in controlled airspace. The test aircraft had eventually reappeared on radar, suffering from what the official report described as cascading avionics failures. The Ghost Protocol program was immediately suspended, its research classified above top secret, and its hardware locked away in storage facilities that Webb was not cleared to access. But Webb had kept copies of the technical specifications. I knew something was wrong when they made us sign new NDAs 6 months after the program ended, he said. Then, when M370 disappeared, I started putting pieces together. The flight path, the radar gaps, the way it just vanished. It was exactly like our second test. Webb believed that Ghost Protocol technology had been secretly installed on MH370, either during routine maintenance or through a more covert operation. The aircraft's disappearance from radar wasn't due to the transponder being turned off. It was because the plane had been rendered electronically invisible. But why? I asked. If they wanted to steal the passengers and their research, why not just arrange for them to disappear after landing in Beijing? Why hijack an entire commercial flight? Webb's answer made me understand why he looked like he hadn't slept in months. Because this wasn't just about stealing research, he said. This was a field test. They wanted to see if they could make a commercial airliner completely disappear in controlled conditions, with the whole world watching. If Ghost Protocol could work on MH370, it could work on anything. Air Force One, enemy bombers, civilian aircraft carrying people they wanted to eliminate without leaving evidence. According to Webb, the aircraft had been remotely piloted using Boeing's uninterruptible autopilot system, a feature designed to prevent hijackings by allowing ground control to override cockpit commands. The system had been modified to accept commands from satellite links, making it possible to control the aircraft from thousands of miles away. They flew it to Diego Garcia, Webb said with absolute certainty, landed it, processed the passengers, then either destroyed the aircraft or flew it somewhere else for permanent storage. The debris that started washing up years later, that was planted, probably dropped from cargo aircraft or submarines to maintain the illusion that the plane crashed in the Indian Ocean. I asked Webb why he was telling me this. Why risk his life, his family's safety, his freedom to expose what amounted to an act of war against civilian aviation? Because they're not going to stop with MH370, he said. I've seen the production schedules for Ghost Protocol components. They're manufacturing this technology on a scale that suggests operational deployment. Commercial aircraft, military transports, maybe even spacecraft. They're planning to disappear things whenever it serves their purposes. Webb gave me a flash drive containing technical specifications for Ghost Protocol, maintenance records from the Boeing facility, where the technology had been developed, and satellite images showing aircraft matching MH370's configuration at Diego Garcia both before and after the disappearance. Then he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would make sure this information reached people who could act on it. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb died in what Everett police described as a single-vehicle automobile accident. His car had left the road during clear weather conditions, striking a tree at an angle that investigators found difficult to explain. The accident occurred on a stretch of highway that Webb had driven safely for 15 years, less than 2 miles from his home. I kept my promise. The first piece of alleged MH370 debris was discovered on July 29th, 2015, on Réunion Island, a French territory in the Western Indian Ocean, roughly 2,300 miles from the aircraft's presumed crash site. The fragment was identified as a flaperon, a movable control surface from the aircraft's wing. Malaysian authorities, French investigators, and Boeing representatives confirmed that the part had come from MH370. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Oceanographic analysis suggested that debris from a crash in the southern Indian Ocean would take between 12 and 18 months to reach Réunion Island, carried by the South Indian Ocean Gyre current system. MH370 had disappeared 16 months earlier, exactly within the predicted time frame. The timing seemed to confirm the official crash location. What didn't make sense was the condition of the flaperon. Marine biology experts who examined the fragment found barnacle growth patterns that were inconsistent with continuous ocean exposure. The barnacles were too mature for the time supposedly spent in the water, but their distribution suggested periods of exposure to different water temperatures and salinity levels. Some marine growth appeared to have been scraped away, then regrown under different conditions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a marine biologist at the University of Cape Town who was not part of the official investigation, published an independent analysis of photographs from the flaperon examination. Her conclusions were startling. The barnacle evidence suggested the debris had been exposed to multiple marine environments over different time periods, as if it had been moved between different oceanic regions before finally washing ashore on Réunion. The growth patterns we observed are consistent with the fragment being stored in controlled saltwater conditions, then introduced to open ocean currents much more recently than the official timeline suggests, Dr. Mitchell wrote in a peer-reviewed paper that was published, then mysteriously retracted 6 weeks later without explanation. But the flaperon was only the beginning. Between 2015 and 2018, more than 30 additional pieces of debris allegedly from MH370 were discovered along coastlines in Mozambique, Madagascar, South Africa and Tanzania. The fragments included wing flaps, interior panels, engine cowlings, and personal items belonging to passengers. Each discovery seemed to reinforce the narrative that MH370 had crashed in the southern Indian Ocean, its wreckage scattered by currents across thousands of miles of coastline. However, when I obtained copies of the detailed forensic reports on these fragments, reports that were not released to the public, I found patterns that suggested a very different explanation. Several fragments showed tool marks indicating they had been deliberately separated from larger structures, rather than torn away by impact forces. Cut marks were straight and clean, inconsistent with the ragged edges that would result from high-speed collision with ocean surface. Some fragments showed evidence of freshwater exposure, mineral deposits and corrosion patterns that could only result from prolonged contact with non-oceanic water sources. Most significantly, isotope analysis of barnacles found on multiple fragments revealed that they had been exposed to water with chemical signatures characteristic of lagoons and enclosed bays, not open ocean environments. The isotope ratios were consistent with water found around coral atolls, formations like those surrounding Diego Garcia. I began to map the discovery locations and timing of debris finds. What emerged was a pattern that followed shipping routes and naval exercise areas used by American and British forces operating in the Indian Ocean. Several fragments were discovered within days of documented US Navy operations in the same coastal regions. In October 2017, I obtained satellite imagery showing US Navy submarines surfacing in the international waters off Mozambique, approximately 48 hours before local fishermen discovered wing fragments on a nearby beach. Similar patterns emerged for discoveries in Madagascar and Tanzania. Naval activity followed by debris finds, with timing that suggested coordinated placement rather than natural drift patterns. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. A former US Navy diver contacted me through encrypted channels in early 2018, claiming he had participated in what his superiors described as deep water salvage training exercises in the Indian Ocean during 2016 and 2017. The exercises involved deploying aircraft debris from submarines at predetermined locations, then monitoring how currents and weather would affect the fragment's movement toward nearby coastlines. We were told it was environmental research, the diver explained during a conversation that I cannot record or document. Something about tracking ocean currents for climate change studies, but the debris we were dropping wasn't generic test materials, it was airplane parts, some of them with identification numbers that had been partially removed or altered. The diver provided GPS coordinates for several drop sites that corresponded exactly with locations where MH370 debris was later discovered. He also described seeing aircraft fragments stored in sealed containers aboard submarines, fragments that showed evidence of controlled saltwater exposure designed to simulate long-term ocean drift. They had marine biologists on the operation, he said, scientists who were cultivating specific types of barnacles and algae, then attaching them to the debris before we dropped it. Everything was designed to look like it had been drifting in the ocean for exactly the right amount of time. The debris discoveries that had seemed to confirm MH370's fate were, in fact, an elaborate deception, designed to maintain the illusion that the aircraft had crashed. Someone had been systematically planting evidence across thousands of miles of coastline, using military resources and scientific expertise to create a false narrative that would satisfy international investigators and grieving families. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. In March 2019, exactly 5 years after MH370's disappearance, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, printed on standard paper with no identifying marks or metadata. The image showed the interior of what appeared to be a military maintenance hangar, with concrete floors, overhead cranes and industrial lighting. In the centre of the frame, partially covered by camouflage netting, was the unmistakable silhouette of a Boeing 777. The aircraft's tail number was not visible, but I could make out distinctive features that matched MH370's configuration. The specific antenna array pattern, the unique winglet design, even scuff marks on the fuselage that corresponded to photographs I had seen of the original aircraft. But what made my hand shake as I examined the image was the background. The hangar's architectural features, the distinctive coral aggregate concrete, the industrial equipment visible in the frame. All of it matched technical specifications I had obtained for maintenance facilities at Diego Garcia. This photograph had been taken inside one of the most secure military installations on Earth, showing an aircraft that the world believed had been destroyed in the Indian Ocean. I spent weeks trying to authenticate the photograph, consulting with experts in digital forensics, aviation identification, and military architecture. Every analysis confirmed what I already knew in my heart. This was MH370, alive and intact, 5 years after its supposed destruction. The implications were staggering. If the aircraft had been preserved rather than destroyed, it meant the passengers might still be alive, held in facilities that existed outside any legal jurisdiction. It meant the debris discoveries were part of an ongoing deception designed to prevent search efforts from focusing on the aircraft's actual location. Most importantly, it meant the operation was still active. Ghost Protocol technology was not just a failed experiment, but a deployed capability being used for purposes I could only imagine. I began making copies of all my research, preparing to release everything through multiple channels simultaneously. I contacted journalists, former colleagues, and documentary filmmakers who might be able to reach audiences that government officials would prefer to keep uninformed. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April 2019, 2 men in dark suits knocked on my door. They identified themselves as FAA investigators, though they carried identification that I couldn't verify through any official channels. They confiscated my computer, my files, my backup drives, and every piece of physical evidence I had collected over 5 years of investigation. They explained that my research had been deemed potentially harmful to ongoing aviation security measures, and that my findings were being classified under provisions of the Patriot Act. I was ordered to cease all investigation activities related to MH370, to avoid contact with media organisations, and to report any attempts by foreign agents to recruit me for intelligence purposes. The men were polite but clear about the consequences of non-compliance, prosecution under the Espionage Act with penalties including life imprisonment. 3 days later, I found a small package in my mailbox. Inside was a single flash drive with a label written in block letters. 370 wasn't the first. The drive contained satellite images spanning the past decade, showing aircraft that had disappeared from civilian tracking systems in various regions around the world. Each image was time-stamped and tagged with coordinates that placed the aircraft at military facilities in remote locations, some in the Pacific, others in the Atlantic, several at installations I couldn't identify. But the most disturbing files on the drive were labelled with future dates, satellite images that appeared to show aircraft that hadn't disappeared yet, positioned at facilities that were still under construction. The operation that had claimed flight MH370 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic program to disappear aircraft whenever strategic interest required it. Planes carrying inconvenient passengers, sensitive cargo, or simply flying routes that could serve as cover for military operations, all of them potential targets for Ghost Protocol deployment. As I write this, I don't know how long I have before the contents of that flash drive are discovered, or before my own disappearance becomes necessary to protect the secrets I've uncovered. But I know that the families of MH370's passengers deserve the truth, even if that truth is more terrible than the uncertainty they've endured for years. Flight MH370 didn't crash in the Indian Ocean. It was stolen by the most advanced intelligence apparatus in human history, using technology that makes aircraft vanish as completely as if they had never existed. The 239 people aboard that flight became the collateral damage in an operation designed to test capabilities that will be used again whenever the strategic calculus demands it. The silence corridor that swallowed MH370 is still active, still waiting for the next flight that carries passengers or cargo too valuable or too dangerous to reach its intended destination. In a world where aircraft can be made to disappear without leaving evidence, where debris can be manufactured and planted to support false narratives, where military technology can override the basic assumption that commercial aviation operates in civilian-controlled airspace, every flight is potentially vulnerable, every passenger is potentially expendable, the next time an aircraft vanishes without explanation, remember MH370. Remember that some disappearances are not accidents, but deliberate acts by organisations that operate beyond the reach of international law, public accountability or human conscience. And remember that in the silence corridor, the truth is whatever serves the interests of those who control the technology to make planes disappear. The sky is no longer safe. It never was. But now at least you know why.